Now, we're went on to say, disturbed about the fact that weapons are used and weapons industry is so alive and well, unfortunately. And one of the tragedies is that the manufacture and sale of weapons, including nuclear weapons, is undoubtedly the most profitable industry in the world today. And that is a problem. What we need to do is to make peace profitable. Now, if you can come up with a way to make peace profitable, the Nobel Peace Prize is definitely yours, and I'll be the first person to support the award. We need to turn things around and change it. And in a country like the United States, every state has a military base or two or three. They have weapons manufacturing capabilities. And that gives employment, and it's good for the local economy. But surely there must be a better way of making money, of surviving, keeping one's family. And there certainly is a better way, and that's what we've got to work towards. In the United Nations Security Council, which, as you know, has 15 members, 5 of which are permanent. They have permanent seats, it's very nice. They have veto power, which means they can say no and make it stick. And their responsibility is to maintain peace and security in the world throughout, including here in Southeast Asia. That's a huge responsibility and a very important one. But the problem is that of these are 5 countries. Probably you know who they are. Does anybody want to tell me the 5 permanent members of the United Nations? Anybody got a, no? 2 bags, 2 badges, 3 books. There's going to be an award for the best question. Okay, I won't put anybody in pain further, but it's France, Britain, Russia, China, and the United States. And where did they come from? Well, they are supposedly the survivors, or I should say the victors of the Second World War. And they decided that henceforth, as the League of Nations failed, the United Nations was not going to fail, and that meant it had to be managed and perhaps controlled. And they set up a charter which has many good aspects to it, and you should look at it someday when it turns up in your education and training. But unfortunately, it has some flaws, and one flaw is that we've got 5 countries, and I include China now in the north as opposed to the south, who control the world and are responsible for peace and security. Unfortunately, the same 5 countries manufacture and sell over 85% of the weapons, including nuclear weapons, in the world today. Well, you can see there's something incompatible there. There's something wrong with that scenario when the people who make weapons and sell weapons, and as I said, make great profits from weapons, are also running the world, or running the world in terms of peace and security. Clearly, that needs to change. And I'll leave that problem to you. And when you grow up, you can change it. And do it as quick as you can, please. But of course, many are working. And in fact, a well-known Malaysian who was president of the General Assembly tried to do this 15 years ago, and it's ongoing to this day. So we've got to do something about that, clearly. And the fact is that armed forces, that wasn't me, armed forces and the preparedness for war and availability of warfare and the temptation to use these extraordinary weapons and the temptation to have them and then possibly use them is something we've got to perhaps stop. And most terrifying of all is the fact that given the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan, and some of you may have seen photographs or videos, it's all on the internet, you can look at it any day you wish, and I invite you to do so. You can see how dreadful these weapons can be and the damage they do. And Nagasaki and Hiroshima were full of people like you and me and our families and our parents and our loved ones. And they were destroyed in one appalling flash of violence. 100,000 were killed like that. Now, it's difficult to identify with 100,000. But think of Kuala Lumpur and think of your neighborhood. That's 100,000 people, perhaps in your neighborhood alone. Gone just like that. You'll understand how frightening this can be. And today, we haven't used these weapons for a long time, happily since 1945. But they're there, and there's not just 2 of them. There's probably 40 or 50,000 of these weapons amongst these 5 countries and a few others like India, Israel, and Pakistan. That's frightening. People can make mistakes. People can get excited, press the wrong button, or lose their cool and decide it's worth it. It's never going to be worth it. So nuclear weapons is something we need to get rid of as quick as we possibly can. Otherwise, we'll all be snuffed out, so to speak. Now, given those concerns, there's now a list, you might say, of things we need to look at. And the first thing is to make sure that if there's going to be warfare, and I've got to say that there is a agreement amongst many. I don't personally agree with this, but then I'm only just one person. But under international law, the little book here, if you look at Article 51, there is an understanding that if you are attacked, whether you're a person or you're a state, you have a right to defend yourself. That's sort of basic to human nature. I guess when we are, you know, many religious leaders have suggested that if somebody hits you on one cheek, the best thing is to turn the other cheek and get slapped there too. Well, of course, that sounds possible, easy maybe, but it's not easy. But it's something, maybe it's the way to go if you can somehow manage that. But many of us, in fact, can't do that and don't do that. So many of us prefer to defend ourselves in some way, perhaps with violence, and it works or it doesn't work. That's perhaps for you to judge, but it's a right under international law. So if a member state is invaded by another member state, like Kuwait, for example, was invaded by Iraq in 1990, Kuwait has a right to defend itself. Likewise with Vietnam, invaded by, well, I don't know what it was called. Was it called a coalition, perhaps? But there are so many examples of where abuse have taken place and defense is allowed. So I don't want to exclude that possibility. Even Mahatma Gandhi, that great Indian man, a pacifist, he also allowed for defense, perhaps recognizing that human nature is such that we can't find a way out of a situation when we're under attack. So I say that. But having said that, we now see warfare on a scale we've never seen it before. We have weapons we've never seen before. We have these horrible things called drones. So somebody can sit thousands of miles away with a computer screen and play the sort of games you may want to play. But when they play games, people really lose their lives. So bombs can be dropped on Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Gaza, managed by somebody who's sitting 10,000 miles away, at home, safely, and at the end of the day, having perhaps dropped these weapons on the wrong people, who then can go home and have dinner with his or her family. That has got to change. Killing people as a method of warfare is something we should all totally abhor. That is not acceptable. Defensive war or aggressive war, whatever it is, it's not acceptable. Secondly, the concept of the Pradhana philosophy is that killing people in warfare is no different from killing people in peacetime. So if you see a murder taking place in Kuala Lumpur and somebody kills another, there's prosecution, it's a crime, there may be a sentence of some sort. I don't quite know what that would be in this case. But that is the way we deal with crime. Now, if you consider warfare, which many of us do, to be a crime, that also needs to be dealt with by prosecution. That does not happen now. Or it only happens to those perhaps who lose the war. But those who win have a different standard, apparently. They have what I would call a double standard. So the bad guy or the loser gets hanged or whatever, and the guy who wins, despite the fact he's violated or they violated international law, because they've won, they're somehow exempt. Well, if you think it through, that's not actually acceptable, because international law applies to every member state and to every country and to all of us, you and me, under domestic law. We're all equal, you know. There's nobody special, nobody different. Even leaders, even politicians can't make decisions that kill people and walk away free. That's not the way it's supposed to be. Does it happen today? It does happen today. For example, Tony Blair was in Malaysia recently at the invitation of I don't quite know whom. He spoke here about justice, and he was paid a great deal of money to do so. But for me, to have Tony Blair speak about justice, a man who went to war in Iraq without any justification, the trumped-up charges against the Iraqis were proven to be absolute nonsense. There was no connection between Iraq or Saddam Hussein and the 9/11 attack in New York. So Mr. Blair misled Westminster and the Parliament. He misled all of us. And that's not acceptable. And he went to war, and people have lost their lives, and Iraq is now a destroyed country. Genocidally, I would say. There are probably 4 or 5 million Iraqis who are displaced, maybe 3 million overseas. So this is a catastrophic situation, which you'd never want to see in Malaysia or anywhere close